Hello, my name is Mary Harrison, and I work at the University of Minnesota in the Center for Early Education and Development. We are part of the Institute of Child Development, and we partner with a center in the School of Social Work called the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare, or CASHU for short. This presentation is about reflective supervision, also known as reflective consultation. It has been created primarily for child welfare professionals who participated in a research study about reflective consultation in child welfare practice. But the training may be of interest to anyone who wants to learn more about reflective supervision. The training is divided into two parts. I am going to present the first part, which will give background and an overview of reflective supervision consultation as a model of professional development and support for people working with infants, young children, and their caregivers. I will also summarize some of the theoretical foundations of this model. The second part of the training is done by my colleague, Dr. Alyssa Meuwissen, who will summarize the research project and findings of the study she led. Please note that for the purposes of this training, I will be using the acronym RSC to include both reflective supervision, which is often provided by someone within an agency, and reflective consultation, which is often provided by an outside consultant. I occasionally will use the full terms of reflective supervision or reflective consultation in this training, but my purpose is always to include both ways of providing this model. Briefly, here is an overview of my presentation. First, I will define and describe RSC. I will then talk about some of the reasons practitioners in many different fields already participate in this model. Then I will provide a brief summary of some of the theories that underlie RSC, as well as some of the ways regular participation in RSC supports child welfare practitioners and others working directly with young children and families. Finally, I will provide a summary of findings from some of my own research, which included interviews with direct service early intervention providers who had participated in RSC. Using their own experiences and descriptions, I can offer a model of how a practitioner can benefit in the short and long term from participating. First, what is reflective supervision or reflective consultation? This model grew out of a recognition by many people from different disciplines, including social work, psychology, early intervention, nursing, early care and education, and others. Many different helping professions needing a way to process the emotional impact of their work. Work with infants, young children, and families, especially those under toxic levels of stress, can evoke strong emotional responses. The RSC model offered a relationship for learning, as one of the early founders described, where a practitioner could safely explore the ways she felt in her work while also being supported for her strengths. As part of this model, attention is paid to the fact that how we feel when we do our work and how we are when we interact with young children and families offers important information for us to reflect upon when thinking about how best to support an individual or family. As a way to help understand this model, we have created two videos. The first, shown here, is an animated video, which provides a visual depiction of how a child welfare professional often absorbs the stress of family experiences and can sometimes feel overwhelmed also by the paperwork and other job pressures. The video then shows how you can do RSC in a one-to-one way or in a small group. I'll talk about it more later in the presentation, but it is theorized that there is a parallel process which suggests that when a child welfare professional feels supported and has time to reflect, she brings that same kind of support to the families with whom she is working. This is a nice segue into the next slide, which asks, why participate in this kind of regular practice? I think many practitioners can relate to Linda Gilkerson's quotation that problems are not usually about the content or development. We know a lot about what to do. The challenge is being able to carry out the strategies given the emotional complexity, team dynamics, personal pressures, and stressors of the program. As the next slide shows, stress in child welfare practice comes from many different places. We know of the high caseloads and a high level of turnover in many communities, and there's increasing awareness of the impact of poverty, housing and food insecurity, community violence, substance abuse challenges, and inequity within our system. And while there is discussion of how challenging the work can be in terms of working with young children and families who have experienced trauma, there is less discussion of the short and long-term impact of this kind of stress on professionals' well-being and their ability to do their work in the ways that they would hope. Looking at the next slide, we see pictures of babies being held, and we're reminded that we are wired to protect young children. We see images here of babies and young children, and it evokes a physiological response inside of us. We feel a tug at our heartstrings, and we want to nurture and care for and hold and protect babies and young children. This is part of our biological makeup because the survival of our species depends on the protection of babies. When we then consider what it feels like to see a baby or young child who has experienced abuse and neglect, we begin to imagine the emotional impact of the work. And when we imagine multiplying the experience of seeing vulnerable young children by the hours and days and weeks and years child protection workers spend working to ensure safety, you really begin to realize that the work can be overwhelming. We think of their caregivers and how many of them themselves were involved in child protection. And we think of the inequity within our system, the racial inequity, the socioeconomic inequity, as well as the limits of what child protection workers can do to help. And we can see why this work can become too much for people at times. In fact, we begin to realize that it seems impossible to do this job without a way to process the highly evocative emotional impact of the work. These considerations provided some of the foundation for the organic co-creation of RSC by many different practitioners from many different disciplines, as I mentioned earlier: social workers, psychologists, nurses, speech, occupational physical therapists, home visitors, Head Start early education, and others. As I said earlier, it is a model of professional development and support where a supervisor or consultant trained in infant mental health facilitates conversations about the emotional impact of the work in a one-on-one format or small group format, with the purpose of both alleviating some of the burnout and distress that builds up and supporting ways the practitioner can be and feel more impactful in her work. Part of the theoretical foundation begins with considering how we learn new things and how we learn to change our current habits and ways of being. And when we think of reflection, we can think of solitary practices like journaling, meditating, walking. These are all valuable habits and facilitate important reflective processes. But sometimes people need more. RSC grew out of the knowledge that important learning happens within safe, trusting, compassionate relationships, where people can pause and consider multiple perspectives, including their own assumptions and biases, for the purpose of finding ways to engage with and deepen their connection with children and families. Another piece of the theoretical foundation comes when we understand how reflection works in our minds and how we first learn to reflect, which happens in our relationships with our primary caregivers. In research, it is called reflective functioning or reflective capacity, and it can be measured using different scales. In general, more reflective capacity means you are able to understand your own and others' mental states. Arietta Slade wrote a great article on the concept of parental reflective functioning, or the extent to which parents can think about themselves and their children. Mental states include our own and others' intentions, feelings, thoughts, desires, beliefs, all with the goal of making sense of and anticipating each other's actions or behaviors. We are creatures of habit. We look for clues from others to tell us what will happen next. The active skill here is sometimes called mentalizing, meaning that a person has the ability to think about and wonder about what they are feeling, as well as to feel things in response to what they are thinking. And our goal is to function without becoming overwhelmed or shutting down. This model evolved before there was a named science of relationships, which has developed more recently. You may be familiar with the work of Dan Siegel, as he brought together experts from many different fields to try to define and describe what happens in relationships and the critical ways healthy relationships can heal and help others. Siegel and others named the science of relationships interpersonal neurobiology, or the ways that relationships impact our brains and bodies. As you can see from the list on the slide, the group included the best science and research from many different areas, and is demonstrating that often the energy and information exchanged in relationships has an impact on everyone involved in the short and long term. And so, when we consider how to bring this science to systems, such as child welfare, we think about the layers of relationships that exist and the different ways people interact and impact each other. Questions include, how can we support young children and their caregivers when they are experiencing toxic stress or trauma? And how can we support the professionals who may experience secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, and burnout from their day in and day out work with trauma? In this slide, we can see that in child welfare, the focus is on the child's safety, but there are lots of people who are learning how to keep children safe, including caregivers, child protection professionals, and the system, by which I mean the rules, policies, and practices of all involved, such as supervisors, county attorneys, guardians ad litem, judges, resource and foster parents, etc., etc., etc. If we learn from reflecting on experience, we need to build time for intentional reflection into layers of the system. RSC starts with providing a safe, trusting, compassionate relationship for learning that ideally occurs monthly or bi-monthly as a way to learn from the emotional experiences of the work. And just as a reminder, our aim is to find a balance as humans in our work and in our relationships. We are trying to learn the capacity to hold, regulate, and fully experience emotion, a non-defensive willingness to engage emotionally, to make meaning of feelings and interpersonal experiences without becoming overwhelmed or shutting down. I know everyone experiences moments of feeling overwhelmed or shutting down, especially in the presence of vulnerable babies and trauma. And when we are too overwhelmed or too shut down, this can get in the way of being able to do our work in the way we would hope. Let's look at what happens in RSC to help us when we get into these states. This slide brings together many of the goals of RSC and of reflective practice, or becoming a reflective practitioner in general. There's a lot of information here, and we will unpack it over the next few slides. But what you can see is that there are several opportunities for different kinds of thinking and feeling and learning that happen during RSC. RSC invites us to wonder about the development of young children, the challenges faced by parents. It challenges us to be open and curious about different perspectives and to wonder about things we might not even be aware of. We are invited to consider our assumptions, which we all bring to the work, and to then set them aside to consider other possibilities. We have a partner in our reflective supervisor or consultant in this place of wondering, this place of not knowing. It can feel uncomfortable to sit in a place of not having all of the information and not knowing immediately what to do. This can cause great distress, especially when the safety and well-being of children and families are at stake. And yet, important learning happens in these moments. When we feel safe with the person we are talking to, we are able to think more clearly. Regular RSC gives our minds and bodies a chance to get better and better at these skills, so that we can more easily come out of a state of feeling overwhelmed or shut down, and then be more responsive and supportive to children and families. We all benefit from this kind of holding environment, an idea first shared by Donald Winnicott years ago. We all need a person with whom we can feel safe enough to be vulnerable and not feel like we have to be an expert. In child protection work, we need to know we are not alone, and we need to trust that we will be helped and supported in figuring out how best to support children and families. The work can be unbelievably complex and can be heartbreaking at times, but there are also opportunities to build on the inherent strengths families have and to support them in ways that feel best for them, in their communities, and in their cultural context. This kind of relational holding environment with a reflective supervisor or consultant provides the safe place to think about these things. And one more mention of the importance of considering multiple perspectives. What is it like to be the baby or young child in this family? What is it like to be mom, dad, grandma, foster mom? What is it like to be you in your role? I think we all feel overwhelmed and stressed at times, and it is easy to want to simplify things in our mind. When we do this, we're making assumptions about people. Remember earlier when I talked about reflective functioning and reflective capacity? The reasons our brains and bodies do this is so we can predict the behavior of others and respond in ways that reduce our feelings of shutting down or being overwhelmed. Simply put, this takes time. Reflection takes time and can be hard, if not impossible, to do alone. A reflective supervisor or consultant stands shoulder to shoulder with child welfare professionals and tries to see the world through the eyes of the babies and children, the parents and caregivers, and everyone else involved in the case. It is in the time taken to consider the complexity that many important ideas are born. Finally, in my experience, the development of infants and young children can sometimes get lost in child protection, where there is a lot of focus on making sure the adults follow the rules and change their behavior. But development doesn't wait. I'll say it again. Children's development does not wait while the grown-ups in the child's life figure out new ways to keep them safe. And most often, babies and children cannot ask for what they need using their words. It is up to us as professionals to take time to consider where we would hope the children would be developmentally and what we can do to support their development while the adults are doing their own important work. This may mean partnering with Help Me Grow or finding a trained mental health professional. We are lucky that now there are research-based mental health treatment options, even for the youngest babies and their caregivers. It is our job to take time to think about each child's experience and how best to support their development within our particular role. Lastly, let's think about your experience participating in RSC. In some research I did a few years ago with early interventionists who worked in homes with families and young children birth to 3, they described what it was like to be in RSC. Most had been in for at least 1 year, and many had been involved for up to 5 years. This slide shows a model of what they described. They talked about being able to release their stress by talking and even listening to others in their RSC group, and that this process helped them to reframe and refocus their thinking on better ways to support families. Finally, they talked about becoming more reflective practitioners overall and over time, who responded to families in ways that supported deeper family engagement and better relationships. This last slide summarizes the change process we hope to see. Jeree Paul, an early infant mental health proponent, used to say, "Do unto others as you would have others do unto others." In other words, what we hope is that the compassionate, safe, reflective relationship for learning will support similar kinds of relationships between a child protection worker and a parent or caregiver, and even between a parent, caregiver, and child. In this model, the quality of the relationship, the compassionate interactions, and creation of trust and safety are crucial parts of any intervention. Finally, here's the other video we made about RSC and child welfare practice. This video includes voices and perspectives of a child protection investigator, a reflective consultant, and an administrator. We hope that hearing them will help deepen your understanding of this model. Thank you for all you do as child welfare professionals. The final slides include a list of references for this presentation, and for more learning, please see the CASHU website, where we have provided a list of resources. Thank you so much for your time and for listening today.